She took her sister's place on the train. The rancher gazed at her and said, "I'll take you." Margaret Sullivan sat by the window of their small Boston apartment, watching the rain streak down the glass while her heart pounded in her chest. In her hands, she held a train ticket that could change everything. The ticket wasn't meant for her. It had her younger sister Emma's name printed clearly across the top. But Emma was upstairs in bed, burning with fever, too sick to even sit up, let alone make the long journey across the country to Montana territory. Margaret looked down at the ticket again, her fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't just any journey. This ticket was supposed to take Emma west to meet a man she'd never seen in person, a rancher named Thomas Brennan who needed a wife. Emma had agreed to become his mail-order bride, exchanging letters with him for 3 months before finally accepting his proposal. It was supposed to be the solution to all their problems. Their family was drowning in debt. Their father had died 2 years ago, leaving behind medical bills that seemed to multiply like weeds in a garden. Their mother was too frail to work, and Margaret's wages from the textile mill barely covered food and rent. Every week brought new threats from creditors, new notices warning them they'd lose their home. Emma's marriage to Thomas Brennan came with a settlement payment that would wipe away all those debts. It was their lifeline, their only hope. But now Emma was too sick to travel, and the wedding was scheduled for just 2 weeks after the train's arrival in Montana. Thomas had made all the arrangements, paid for everything, and was expecting his bride to arrive on schedule. If Emma didn't show up, he might cancel everything. The settlement money would disappear. Their family would be ruined. Margaret stood up and walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall. She studied her reflection carefully. At 28 years old, she'd long ago accepted that marriage wasn't in her future. She was the practical daughter, the responsible one who stayed home to care for their mother and worked to keep food on the table. Emma was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who deserved a chance at happiness and a better life. They didn't look much alike. Emma had golden blonde hair that caught the sunlight and made her look like something from a painting. She was petite and delicate, with a sweet smile that made everyone want to protect her. Margaret, on the other hand, was taller and more sturdy in build. Her hair was a dark auburn color, and her hands were rough from years of hard work. Where Emma was soft and gentle, Margaret was practical and strong. But desperate times called for desperate measures. Margaret climbed the stairs to the bedroom she shared with Emma. Her sister was sleeping fitfully, her face flushed with fever. The doctor had said it would be at least 2 or 3 weeks before Emma would be well enough to travel. 2 or 3 weeks too late. "Emma," Margaret whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her sister's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with illness. "Is it time?" Emma asked weakly. "Do I need to pack?" Margaret's heart clenched. "No, sweetheart. You're too sick to travel. You know that." Tears rolled down Emma's fevered cheeks, but the wedding, Mr. Brennan, the money to help Mother, what will we do? Margaret took her sister's hot hand gently. "I have an idea, but you have to trust me. I'm going to go in your place." Emma's eyes widened. "What?" "He's expecting me. He has my photograph." "I'll explain everything when I get there," Margaret said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'll tell him you're sick, and that I came to ask him to wait a few more weeks. Surely he'll understand. He seems like a reasonable man from his letters." This wasn't entirely true. Margaret had read all of Thomas Brennan's letters to Emma, studying them late at night when she couldn't sleep. His writing was brief and to the point. He didn't waste words on flowery poetry or romantic declarations. He wrote about his ranch, about the hard work of building something in the Montana territory, about needing a strong partner to share the load. He wrote about practical matters, what kind of life Emma could expect, what would be required of her, what he could offer in return. Emma had read romance into those practical words, imagining a handsome cowboy who was simply too shy or too busy to write sweet nothings. Margaret wasn't so sure. She suspected Thomas Brennan was exactly what his letters suggested, a practical man looking for a practical solution to a practical problem. He needed a wife to help run his ranch. Emma needed a husband to escape poverty. It was a business arrangement wrapped in the language of marriage. But, Margaret, what if he refuses? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "What if he sends you away? Then I'll come home, and we'll figure something else out," Margaret said, though she had no idea what that something else might be. "But I have to try. We don't have any other options." Over the next 24 hours, Margaret prepared for the journey with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything in her life. She packed Emma's small trunk with the clothes her sister had been preparing, simple, practical dresses that would suit a ranch wife. She read through all of Thomas Brennan's letters again and again, memorizing every detail he'd shared about himself and his life. She studied the photograph he'd sent, trying to get a sense of the man from the stern, unsmiling face that stared back at her from the faded image. Their mother cried when Margaret explained the plan, but she was too weak and too desperate to argue. "Come home safe," was all she could manage to say, clutching Margaret's hand. "Promise me you'll come home safe," Margaret promised, though she wasn't certain it was a promise she could keep. The morning of the departure arrived cold and gray. Margaret wore Emma's best traveling dress, a simple blue cotton, with a modest collar. It fit reasonably well, though it was a bit short on Margaret's taller frame. She pinned her auburn hair up in a style similar to Emma's, though the color difference was impossible to hide. She carried Emma's small trunk and the leather bag containing all the letters and the precious train ticket. At the station, Margaret boarded the train with her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone around her must be able to hear it. She found her seat and pressed her face to the window, watching Boston fade into the distance. With every mile, she was leaving behind everything she'd ever known, her family, her home, her entire life. The journey would take 5 days, crossing through states and territories Margaret only read about in books. She'd never been more than 10 miles from Boston in her entire life. Now she was traveling across the country to meet a stranger and pretend to be someone she wasn't. During the long days on the train, Margaret watched the landscape change outside her window. The crowded cities gave way to small towns, then to farmland, then to wide open spaces that seemed to stretch forever. She'd never imagined the country was so big, so empty, so beautiful in its wildness. She shared her train car with other travelers, and sometimes they would talk. Margaret was careful about what she said, worried about contradicting something Emma might have written in her letters. She kept mostly to herself, reading and rereading those letters until she practically had them memorized. At night, lying in her narrow berth while the train rocked and swayed, Margaret would stare at the ceiling and wonder what she was doing. This plan had seemed necessary, even inevitable, back in Boston. But now, getting closer to Montana with every passing hour, the full weight of her deception began to sink in. She was going to show up as a complete stranger and somehow convince a man to marry her sister instead of sending them both away. It seemed impossible. But what other choice did she have? Her family was depending on her. Emma was depending on her. She couldn't turn back now. On the 5th day, the train began climbing into mountain country. Margaret pressed her face to the window, awed by the towering peaks and deep valleys. It was the most magnificent thing she'd ever seen, and also the most frightening. This was truly a different world from the crowded streets of Boston. As the train finally began to slow, approaching the station in Helena, Montana, Margaret's hands started shaking. She gripped them together in her lap, trying to steady herself. In just a few minutes, she would step off this train and come face to face with Thomas Brennan. In just a few minutes, everything would change. She had no idea if he would listen to her explanation. She had no idea if he would understand or if he would simply put her back on the next train east. All she knew was that she had to try. For Emma, for their mother, for their family's survival, she had to at least try. A train whistle blew, announcing their arrival. Margaret stood up on shaky legs, smoothed down her dress, and picked up her bags. Through the window, she could see the platform crowded with people waiting to meet the arriving passengers. Somewhere in that crowd was Thomas Brennan, waiting for a bride who would never arrive. Margaret took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and stepped toward the door. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back now. The platform was crowded with people when Margaret stepped off the train. Her legs felt unsteady after 5 days of travel, and her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst right out of her chest. She clutched Emma's small trunk in one hand and scanned the crowd of faces, looking for a man who matched the photograph she'd studied so many times. The air in Montana was different from Boston. It was cleaner somehow, crisper, and carried scents she couldn't quite identify. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow, even though it was late spring. Everything felt bigger here, wider, as if the sky itself had more room to stretch. Margaret stood on the platform, uncertain where to go or what to do. Other passengers moved around her, greeting loved ones or heading toward the town. She felt completely lost, a stranger in a strange land, playing a role she had no business playing. Then she saw him. Thomas Brennan stood at the edge of the platform, holding something in his hands. Even from a distance, Margaret could tell it was a photograph, probably the one Emma had sent him months ago. He was taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. He wore a plain cotton shirt, work pants, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. Everything about him looked practical and worn from use, including the boots on his feet. Margaret forced herself to walk toward him, her legs feeling like they were made of wood. With each step, she could see his expression more clearly. He was studying every woman who passed by, comparing them to the photograph in his hands. When his eyes finally landed on Margaret, she saw him go completely still. She stopped a few feet away from him, unable to make herself come any closer. They stood there in silence, studying each other. Margaret could see the confusion in his blue eyes as he looked from the photograph to her face and back again. His jaw tightened, and she saw something that might have been disappointment or anger flash across his features. "You're not her," he said finally. His voice was deep and quiet, but there was no question in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact. Margaret's carefully prepared speech flew right out of her head. She'd practiced what she would say for 5 solid days, rehearsing the words until they sounded natural and reasonable. But now, standing in front of this tall, serious man whose blue eyes saw right through her deception, every single word disappeared. No, I'm not," she managed to stammer. "Margaret Sullivan, Emma's sister?" Thomas didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Around them, the platform was gradually emptying as other passengers departed with their families or headed into town. Soon they would be alone. Margaret's words came tumbling out in a rush, tripping over each other in her desperation to explain. "Emma is sick. She caught a fever 2 weeks ago, and the doctor said she couldn't travel. But we couldn't send word in time, and the wedding is scheduled, and our family desperately needs the settlement money you sent. We're going to lose everything if this marriage doesn't happen. I came to ask if you would wait a few more weeks until Emma recovers. She'll come then, I promise. She wants to come. She wants to be your wife. This isn't her fault. Please don't punish our family because of circumstances beyond our control." She ran out of breath and stopped talking, her chest heaving. Thomas continued to look at her with that same calm, unreadable expression. He didn't look angry exactly, but he didn't look pleased either. He looked like a man who was thinking very carefully about something. The silence stretched between them, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Margaret felt sweat trickle down her back despite the cool mountain air. She wanted to say more, to fill the terrible silence with more explanations and apologies, but something told her to wait, to give him time to think. Finally, Thomas folded the photograph and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He picked up Margaret's trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, which it probably didn't to a man used to ranch work. Then he said something Margaret had never expected to hear. "I'll take you." Margaret blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I'll take you," Thomas repeated, his tone matter of fact. "I need a wife." "You need a way to help your family. Those are the basic facts of the situation." "But you were expecting Emma," Margaret protested, her mind spinning. "You exchanged letters with her. She's the one who agreed to marry you." Thomas shifted the trunk to his other hand and started walking toward a wagon parked at the edge of the street. Margaret had no choice but to follow him, practically running to keep up with his long strides. "Your sister made promises through those letters," Thomas said without looking back at her. "You're here to keep them. That shows more integrity than most people have." "But I'm not what you were expecting," Margaret said, aware of how foolish she sounded. "I'm older than Emma. I'm not as pretty. I'm taller and stronger, and I've worked in factories. I'm not delicate or gentle or any of the things men want in a wife." Thomas stopped walking and turned to look at her. For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "I don't need delicate, Miss Sullivan. I need someone who won't break when things get hard. And out here, things get hard pretty regular." He loaded her trunk into the back of the wagon with practiced ease, then offered his hand to help her up onto the wooden seat. Margaret stared at his calloused palm for a moment before taking it. His grip was strong and steady, and he lifted her up as easily as he'd lifted the trunk. Thomas climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses started moving without him needing to say a word, as if they knew the way home by heart. The wagon rolled down the dusty main street of Helena, past wooden buildings and busy shops. People waved at Thomas, and he nodded back but didn't stop to introduce Margaret or explain who she was. "I don't understand," Margaret said quietly, once they'd left the town behind and were rolling across open prairie. "Why would you agree to marry me instead of Emma? You don't even know me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "I've been building a ranch out here for 7 years, Miss Sullivan. It's hard work, the kind that breaks a person down if they try to do it alone. I tried for a long time and it nearly killed me. I need a partner, someone to share the load. That's why I sent for a mail-order bride in the first place." He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the horses. "Your sister wrote pretty letters about wanting adventure and romance, but I don't need romance, and adventure out here usually means something's gone wrong. I need someone practical, someone who understands hard work, Someone who won't fall apart when things get difficult. Margaret listened, barely breathing, as he continued. You came all this way on a train by yourself to try and save your family. You were willing to face a stranger and beg him to wait for your sister. That takes courage. You've got capable hands and a direct way of speaking. You don't flutter or faint or act helpless. He paused, then added, I think you'll do just fine. But what about Emma? Margaret asked, guilt washing over her. She was supposed to marry you. This was supposed to be her new life. Your sister can make her own life, Thomas said simply. Seems to me she's got you to take care of things for her. Maybe it's time someone thought about what you need instead of what everyone else needs from you. His words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She turned away, blinking back sudden tears. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her before. Nobody had ever suggested that her needs mattered as much as everyone else's. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon rocking gently over the uneven ground. Margaret tried to process everything that had just happened. She'd come here expecting rejection, expecting to plead for her sister's chance at this marriage. Instead, she'd been accepted herself, chosen for qualities she'd never thought anyone would value. How far is your ranch? She asked finally, needing to break the silence. About 2 hours from town, Thomas replied. It's isolated, I won't lie about that. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. It gets lonely sometimes, especially in winter when the snow makes travel impossible. Margaret nodded, trying to imagine what that kind of isolation would feel like. In Boston, she'd been surrounded by people all the time. Neighbors in the crowded apartment building, workers at the factory, crowds on the streets. Out here, the land stretched empty and endless in every direction. I should warn you, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a serious tone, it's not an easy life. The cabin is small and rough. There's no fancy furniture or decorations. Water has to be hauled from the well. Laundry is hard work. Cooking is done on a wood stove that has a temper worse than any mule. In summer, it's hot as blazes, and in winter, the cold gets into your bones and stays there. I'm not afraid of hard work, Margaret said quietly. I've been working since I was old enough to hold a broom. I know how to make do with very little. Thomas nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. There's animals to care for. Chickens, cows, horses. The garden needs constant attention, or it dies in this climate. There's always something that needs fixing or mending or building. Some days I don't stop working from sunup to sundown. I understand, Margaret said, and she meant it. This wasn't a fairy tale. This wasn't a romance novel where everything would be perfect and easy. This was real life, hard and demanding, and she was prepared for that in a way Emma never could have been. They crested a small hill, and Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop. There, he said, pointing to a valley below. That's the ranch. Margaret looked where he was pointing and saw a small cabin nestled in the valley, with a barn beside it and fenced pasture stretching out beyond. It was tiny compared to what she'd imagined, rough and basic. But there was something appealing about it, too, something solid and real. This was a place built by human hands through hard work and determination. This was a place that meant something. It's not much, Thomas said, and for the first time she heard something uncertain in his voice. But it's honest work and honest living. I won't ever be rich, but we'll have enough. We'll have a roof and food and each other for help when times get tough. Margaret looked at the ranch, then at Thomas's weathered profile, then back at the ranch. She thought about Boston, about the crowded apartment and the crushing debts and the endless worry. She thought about Emma in her sickbed and their frail mother and the life she'd been living, always working for others, never for herself. It looks fine to me, she said softly. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but understanding, recognition. Two practical people facing hard circumstances and deciding to face them together. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon started rolling again, down toward the valley and toward whatever future awaited them there. The storm came without warning, the way spring storms often did in Montana. Margaret had been hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she noticed the sky turning an odd, greenish-gray color. The wind picked up suddenly, whipping her skirts around her legs and tearing one of Thomas's shirts right off the line. She grabbed the basket of wet clothes and ran for the cabin just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. By the time she got inside, the rain had turned to sleet. Thomas came running from the barn, his hat pulled low against the driving wind. He burst through the door and slammed it shut behind him, breathing hard. "Storm's going to be bad," he said, shaking the ice from his coat. "I got all the animals secured in the barn. We might be stuck inside for a few days." Margaret looked out the window and watched as the world outside turned white. The sleet came down so thick she could barely see the barn, even though it was only 50 feet away. The wind howled around the cabin, making the walls creak and groan. She'd seen snowstorms in Boston, but nothing like this. This was nature showing its full power, wild and unstoppable. They spent the rest of that day preparing. Thomas brought in extra firewood and stacked it by the stove. Margaret cooked a large pot of stew that would last them several meals. They filled every container they had with water from the pump, knowing the cold might freeze the pipes. By nightfall, the cabin was as ready as it could be, and they settled in to wait out the storm. The first night wasn't too bad. They ate dinner in companionable silence, as they usually did. Margaret mended some torn work shirts while Thomas cleaned and oiled his tools. The wind howled outside, but the cabin stayed warm and dry. When it was time for sleep, Margaret went to her corner of the cabin, separated by a hanging blanket, while Thomas made his bed near the stove. They'd maintained this careful distance for weeks now, respecting each other's space, keeping things proper. But on the second day, the storm grew worse. The wind picked up until it sounded like a living thing screaming around the cabin. Snow began mixing with the sleet, piling up against the walls until Margaret worried they might be buried alive. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning in the stove. Thomas went out twice that day to check on the animals, fighting his way through waist-deep snow to reach the barn. Each time he came back, he was covered in ice, his face red and raw from the cold. Margaret made him hot coffee and wrapped blankets around his shoulders until he stopped shivering. She watched him struggle and realized with a jolt that she was worried about him. Not just worried the way you'd worry about anyone facing danger, but worried in a deeper way that surprised her. On the third day, they woke to find the storm still raging. The cabin felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in. They couldn't go outside except for quick trips to the barn. There was nothing to do but sit and wait and try not to go crazy from being trapped inside. That's when they started talking. Really talking, not just the practical exchanges about work and chores that had made up most of their conversations until now. It started simply enough. Margaret was trying to darn a sock when she pricked her finger with the needle. She made a small sound of frustration, and Thomas looked up from the piece of leather he was working on. "You don't have to do that right now," he said. "The sock can wait until the storm passes." "I don't like sitting idle," Margaret replied, sucking the drop of blood from her finger. It makes me feel useless." Thomas set down his work and looked at her thoughtfully. "You've never been useless a day in your life, have you?" "Always working, always taking care of something or someone." Margaret shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "That's just life. Things need doing, so you do them." "Tell me about Boston," Thomas said, surprising her. "Tell me about your life before you came here." So Margaret told him. She talked about the textile mill where she'd worked since she was 16, the long hours and low pay and constant fear of injury from the machines. She talked about her father's death and the debts he'd left behind, the way they'd multiplied like weeds, no matter how hard she tried to pay them down. She talked about caring for her mother, who'd grown frailer with each passing year, and about Emma, beautiful Emma, who everyone loved and wanted to protect. "I was the strong one," Margaret said softly. That's what everyone always said. "Margaret is strong. Margaret can handle it. Margaret will take care of everything." And I did. I took care of everything. I worked and saved and sacrificed, and it was never quite enough. Thomas listened without interrupting, his blue eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The wind howled outside, and the fire crackled in the stove. But inside the cabin there was a strange sort of peace. "That's a heavy load for one person to carry," Thomas said finally. "Did anyone ever ask you what you wanted? What you needed?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. What I wanted didn't matter. We were drowning, and I was the only one strong enough to swim. You do what you have to do. "And what about now?" Thomas asked. "What do you want now?" Margaret looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside her chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "I came here thinking I was doing this for Emma, for my family. But now, I don't know anymore." Thomas nodded slowly. Then he started talking, and Margaret realized it was the most he'd ever said to her at one time. He told her about his first wife, Sarah. They'd been young when they married, both of them full of dreams about building a life together in Montana. Sarah had been delicate and sweet, not really suited for ranch life, but determined to make it work because she loved him. "She got pregnant our second year here," Thomas said, his voice rough with old pain. "We were so happy." thought we were starting our family, building something that would last. But the pregnancy was hard on her. Now. She was sick all the time, couldn't keep food down. By the time the baby came, she was already so weak. Margaret's heart clenched as she listened. She could see the grief still etched in the lines of his face. The baby was a boy, Thomas continued. Perfect little thing, but something went wrong. Sarah started bleeding and couldn't stop. The nearest doctor was hours away in town, and with the roads muddy from spring rain, I couldn't get her there in time. I lost them both in one night, my wife and my son. I'm so sorry, Margaret whispered, but the words felt inadequate. Thomas shook his head. That was 5 years ago. For a long time after, I just worked. Sunrise to sunset, working myself into the ground, because if I stopped, I'd have to think. I'd have to feel. I became like a machine, just going through the motions of living without actually being alive. He looked at Margaret then, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes that he usually kept hidden. That's why I sent for a mail-order bride, not because I was lonely for romance or companionship. I was afraid I was forgetting how to be human, how to be a person instead of just a working machine. The confession hung in the air between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something was changing. The careful distance they'd maintained was dissolving, replaced by a different kind of closeness. I understand that, Margaret said quietly. Being a machine, I mean. When you work so hard for so long, you forget there's supposed to be more to life than just surviving. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. But there's more, Margaret. There has to be. Otherwise, what's the point of any of it? They talked through the afternoon and into the evening. Thomas told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to build something that would last, something that mattered. Margaret talked about the books she used to read as a girl, dreams of adventure and seeing new places that she'd given up long ago. As darkness fell and they lit the lamps, Thomas got up and moved to sit closer to Margaret, touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. You matter here, Margaret, he said, his voice low and sincere. To the ranch, yes. You've worked harder than I ever expected, and you've made this place better just by being here. But more than that, you matter to me. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Thomas, I know this wasn't what either of us planned, he continued. You came here thinking you'd save your sister's marriage. I was expecting someone completely different, but somehow, against all odds, this is working. You and me, we work together. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused against hers, warm and solid and real. I'm not good with fancy words, Thomas said, but I want you to know that I'm glad you're here. Not as a replacement for Emma or anyone else. I'm glad you're here because you're you. Margaret looked down at their joined hands and felt tears prick her eyes. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her. Nobody had ever been glad for her, specifically her, just as she was. I'm glad I'm here too, she whispered. I didn't expect to be, but I am. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped while the storm continued outside. Something had shifted between them, something fundamental. The careful politeness had given way to genuine connection. The business arrangement was becoming something more, something real and deep and worth fighting for. On the fourth morning, the storm finally began to clear. Thomas went out to check on the animals while Margaret started breakfast. When he came back in, stamping snow from his boots, he was carrying a bundle of letters that had been left in the barn's shelter. Mail came through before the storm hit, he said, handing them to Margaret. Must have forgotten about them in the rush to get everything secured. Margaret took the letters with trembling hands. She recognized her mother's handwriting on the top envelope. With shaking fingers, she opened it and began to read. As she read, her face went pale. Thomas noticed immediately and came to stand beside her. What is it? What's wrong? It's Emma, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. She's recovered. She's engaged to someone in Boston, a banker's son. The debts are all paid with the settlement money you sent. She looked up at Thomas, her eyes wide and confused. Emma's getting married to someone else. She doesn't want to come to Montana. She never did, really. She was just desperate, and now she's not desperate anymore. Thomas took the letter gently from her hands and read it himself. At the bottom, Emma had written a final message specifically for Margaret. I hope you found something there worth staying for. You've always taken care of everyone else. Maybe it's time you let yourself be happy. Please forgive me, and please be happy. So, Thomas said slowly, setting the letter down. Your sister is settled. Your family's debts are paid. You're free to go home if you want. Margaret stood up and walked to the window. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, making the snow sparkle like diamonds. She thought about Boston, about the crowded apartment and the factory, and the life she'd left behind. Then she thought about this cabin, this rough, simple place where she'd worked harder than ever before but somehow felt more alive than she had in years. She thought about Thomas, quiet, steady Thomas, who saw her as more than just a pair of working hands, who valued her strength instead of being threatened by it, who'd shared his deepest pain with her and trusted her with his grief. "What if I don't want to be free?" she asked, not turning around. "What if I want to stay?" She heard Thomas move, felt him come to stand behind her. "Then I'd say we ought to have a proper wedding," he said. "Not one based on obligation and desperation. A real one where we both choose this because we want to." Margaret turned to face him then. His face was serious, but his eyes were warm, and when he held out his hand to her, she took it without hesitation. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you. For real this time." The morning after the storm cleared, Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. The world outside was transformed, covered in a blanket of pristine white snow that made everything look clean and new. She lay in her bed for a moment, thinking about everything that had changed in just a few days. The storm had trapped them inside the cabin, but it had also freed something between them, something honest and real that had been building since the day she'd arrived. Thomas was already up, as he always was, stoking the fire in the stove. When Margaret emerged from behind her curtain, he looked up and smiled at her. It was a real smile, warm and genuine, so different from the careful politeness they'd maintained for weeks. That smile made her heart skip in a way she'd never experienced before. "Coffee's ready," he said, pouring her a cup. "And I was thinking if you're serious about staying, about us getting married proper, we should probably do it right. Not rush into anything, but do it the way it should be done." Margaret took the coffee gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "What did you have in mind?" Thomas sat down across from her at the rough wooden table. "Well, for starters, I think we should go into town and talk to the minister, make sure everything is legal and proper. And maybe," he paused, looking almost shy, "maybe you'd want to pick out some fabric for a new dress, something special for the wedding." The thoughtfulness of his suggestion touched Margaret deeply. She'd been wearing Emma's old dresses and her own worn work clothes since she'd arrived. The idea of having something new, something chosen just for her, felt like an incredible luxury. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Over the next few days, they fell into a new rhythm. The storm had broken down the walls between them, and now they talked more freely. Thomas taught Margaret how to milk the cows properly, laughing when she got squirted in the face on her first try. Margaret showed Thomas how to mend his shirts more neatly so the patches would last longer. They worked side by side, and slowly the cabin began to feel less like a workplace and more like a home. 1 week after the storm, they made the journey into Helena. The roads were muddy from the melting snow, and the wagon jolted over every rut and bump, but Margaret didn't mind. She sat beside Thomas on the wooden seat, close enough that their shoulders touched whenever the wagon swayed. It felt comfortable and right, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of just weeks. Helena was busy when they arrived. People crowded the wooden sidewalks, going about their business. Several people waved at Thomas, and Margaret noticed the curious looks they gave her. She knew what they were thinking. This wasn't the delicate blonde girl from the photograph Thomas had been showing around town. This was someone entirely different. Their first stop was the church. Reverend Morrison was a kind-faced older man with silver hair and gentle eyes. He listened carefully as Thomas explained the situation, how Emma had been too sick to travel, how Margaret had come in her place, and how they decided to marry each other instead. The Reverend didn't seem shocked or disapproving, which surprised Margaret. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully and said, "The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes the path we think we're on leads us somewhere completely different, somewhere better than we could have imagined." He agreed to perform the ceremony in 6 weeks, giving them time to prepare properly. "Use this time to really get to know each other," he advised. "Marriage is more than just sharing a home and work. It's about sharing your lives, your hopes, your fears. Build that foundation strong, and it'll hold you through anything." After leaving the church, Thomas took Margaret to the general store. The owner, Mrs. Henderson, was a plump, cheerful woman who immediately took Margaret under her wing. She showed her bolts of fabric in various colors and patterns, exclaiming over each one, "This blue would bring out your eyes," Mrs. Henderson said, holding up a soft cotton print. "Or this cream color. Very elegant for a wedding. What do you think, Mr. Cowboy?" "Brennan?" Thomas, looking slightly uncomfortable, surrounded by all the feminine fabrics and notions, cleared his throat. "Whatever Margaret wants," he said. "Whatever makes her happy." Margaret ran her hands over the different fabrics, feeling the textures. In Boston, she'd only ever owned practical, serviceable clothes in dark colors that wouldn't show dirt from the factory. The idea of choosing something pretty, something just because she liked it, felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Finally, she chose a soft gray fabric with tiny white flowers scattered across it. It wasn't pure white like a traditional wedding dress, but it was beautiful and practical, something she could wear to church on Sundays after the wedding, not just a fancy dress that would sit unused in a trunk. Mrs. Henderson also insisted on selling them lace for the collar and cuffs. "Every bride needs a little bit of lace," she said firmly. "Even practical ranch brides." While Mrs. Henderson was cutting the fabric and wrapping it, she chatted easily with Margaret. "The whole town's been curious about you," she admitted. "Thomas is a good man, one of the best. After he lost Sarah and the baby, we all worried about him. He worked himself nearly to death, wouldn't talk to anyone, wouldn't accept help. When he sent for a mail-order bride, we were all relieved. Thought maybe he was finally ready to live again." She handed Margaret the wrapped package and smiled warmly. "I can see he made a good choice, even if it wasn't the choice he thought he was making. You've got a capable look about you. You'll do well here." Thomas also bought supplies they needed for the ranch: flour, sugar, coffee, nails, and various other items. But before they left, he did something that surprised Margaret. He bought her a book. "I remembered you said you used to like reading," he explained, looking almost embarrassed. "Thought you might like something for the evenings when the work is done." Margaret held the book carefully, running her fingers over the cover. It was a collection of adventure stories, the kind she'd dreamed over as a girl. That Thomas had remembered this detail from their stormbound conversation, had thought to do something just to make her happy, touched her more than any grand romantic gesture could have. On the ride back to the ranch, Margaret sat even closer to Thomas than before. As they traveled, they talked about the wedding plans. Thomas wanted to invite some of the neighboring ranchers and their families, people who'd been kind to him over the years. Margaret worried she wouldn't have anyone from her side, but Thomas assured her that didn't matter. "We're starting fresh," he said, "building something new together. Your past and my past brought us here, but now we get to decide what comes next." The weeks leading up to the wedding flew by in a whirl of activity. Margaret sewed her dress in the evenings by lamplight, carefully stitching each seam. During the days, they worked together to prepare the cabin and ranch for married life. Thomas built a proper bedroom area with real walls instead of just a hanging curtain, giving them privacy and separation. He also made Margaret a small dressing table, simple but sturdy, with a mirror he'd bought in town. Margaret planted a garden, preparing the soil for vegetables they'd need to see them through the next winter. She also started some flower seeds, wildflowers that would add color around the cabin. It wasn't practical or necessary, but it made the place feel more like a home, more like theirs. They wrote letters together to Margaret's family in Boston. Thomas insisted on writing to Margaret's mother himself, formally asking for her blessing even though the situation was far from traditional. Margaret wrote to Emma a long letter explaining everything that had happened, how she'd found something unexpected in Montana, something real and true and worth choosing. Emma's response arrived 2 weeks before the wedding. She was happy for Margaret, truly happy, and relieved that everything had worked out. "You deserve this," Emma wrote. "You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Now let someone take care of you for a change. Be happy, sister. Be so wonderfully happy." Their mother's letter was tearful but blessing. She wished she could be there for the wedding, but understood the distance made it impossible. "I was worried about you, Margaret," she wrote. "You were so strong, so capable. I sometimes forgot you needed love and happiness, too. Mr. Brennan sounds like a good man. Build a good life together." As the wedding day approached, Margaret found herself getting nervous. Not about marrying Thomas, she was certain about that, but about the ceremony itself, about standing in front of people and making promises that would bind their lives together forever. It felt significant and serious and wonderful all at once. The night before the wedding, Thomas asked Margaret to take a walk with him. The evening was beautiful, with the sun setting behind the mountains in shades of gold and pink. They walked to a small rise above the ranch where they could see the whole valley spread out below them. "I want to tell you something," Thomas said, taking her hand. "I know this all started in a strange way. You came here pretending to be someone else, and I accepted you because I needed help. But, Margaret, somewhere along the way, this became real for me. You became real to me. Not as a solution to a problem or a pair of working hands, but as a person I care about. A person I love." The last word came out soft and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to say it. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words to anyone. I thought my life was already decided, already over in all the ways that mattered. But then I got on that train, and everything changed. You changed everything." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her gently but firmly. They stood there as the sun set, two people who'd found each other in the most unexpected way, ready to build a life together. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Margaret dressed in her gray and white dress, her hair carefully styled with the help of Mrs. Ribb, Henderson who'd arrived early to assist. When Margaret looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked happy, truly happy, in a way she never had before. The church was full when they arrived. The neighboring ranchers and their families had turned out in force, along with many of the townspeople who'd known Thomas for years. Margaret walked down the aisle alone, her head held high, and met Thomas at the altar. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with warmth and sincerity. When it came time for the vows, Thomas and Margaret looked into each other's eyes and spoke their promises clearly and firmly. They weren't the traditional words exactly. Reverend Morrison had helped them craft vows that reflected their unique situation and genuine feelings. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Thomas said. "To work beside you, to support you, to value your strength and your gentleness equally. I promise to build a life with you, not for you, and to face whatever comes together." Margaret's voice was steady as she replied, "I promise to be honest with you always, to work hard for our shared dreams, to be your companion in both joy and hardship. I promise to choose you every day for all the days we have together." When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Margaret gently, sweetly, and the small church erupted in applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Margaret saw smiling faces on every side. These people were celebrating them, celebrating this unexpected love story that had brought happiness out of desperation. The reception was held in the church hall, with food contributed by various families. There was music and dancing, laughter and celebration. Margaret, who'd never been to a party in her honor before, felt overwhelmed by the kindness and acceptance these strangers, no neighbors, showed her. As the sun began to set, Thomas and Margaret climbed into their wagon to head home. People waved and called out good wishes. The ranch looked beautiful in the evening light, and as Thomas helped Margaret down from the wagon, she realized something important. This was home now. Not just a place she was staying, not just a solution to her family's problems, but truly home. The cabin, the land, the life they would build together. It was all hers now, theirs together. When their daughters asked how they met, Thomas would smile and say, "Your mother stepped off that train and I took one look and knew she was exactly who I needed." Margaret would add, "Sometimes taking the wrong train leads you to exactly the right place." They would share a look then, full of love and understanding and gratitude for the strange journey that had brought them together. What had started as deception and desperation had become the most honest, true thing in either of their lives, a partnership built on respect, strengthened by hardship, and deepened by genuine love that grew stronger with each passing day.